Thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you, Venkat, for hosting this. Most of us journalists who have been doing this career for a long time are hard-bitten, a little testy, and aggressive. And this man here may be one of the kindest people I've met in our dog-eat-dog profession. So I really mean that. You've been incredibly warm and hospitable since the night that we first met here. And this is my wife, as Venkat had introduced. And if you look at the cover of the book, there's two tiny little figures in the corner that are supposed to represent me and this beautiful woman who's been the love of my life since we first met. So I am the New York Times South Asia Bureau Chief. We moved here in August. We had spent 11 years in East Africa. I was the East Africa Bureau Chief for the New York Times for 11 years. That's about 3 times longer than anybody had ever held that job. Many people see Africa as a starter job. You start there when you're a young guy, you move on to London or Moscow or India, a place of bigger global significance. I had always wanted to be in East Africa and didn't want to move on. And we had our 2 children who were born there. We stayed there a long time. I covered many different things and went through different phases as a journalist. When I first started, I was absorbed into many big conflicts. In 2006, when I began, Darfur was on fire. Darfur, Sudan, which is the western part of Sudan, had this horrible insurgency that the government crushed and was incredibly brutal. And that was a big global story for years. And this all seems, even to me, it seems very far away now. And I'm sure for you sitting in this room listening to, Africa and Darfur, it must be hard to kind of put your finger on what it's really like. Congo was also a big story when I first started. A horrible civil war. Somalia, another really bad civil war. And there was a connection between all these. I mean, each of these conflicts had their own dynamic, but they all connected in the sense that they were springing out of state failure, and that many countries in Africa have very weak governments, and there's no security for the people that live in these spaces, and anybody with a gun or a grievance can emerge and take power with their own hands and be incredibly brutal and violent. And I found myself writing a lot about that. And I was looking forward to coming to India to get a break from that. And that's been pretty true, except I spent a fair bit of my time in covering the Rohingya issue in this man's fine country, Bangladesh, which is not a product of Bangladesh, but nearly 1 million people have fled to Bangladesh because they were being massacred and brutalized. So I haven't totally left the conflict vein, but as I evolved, as I spent more and more time in Africa, I craved to get away from these conflict stories, because I felt like I was presenting a very one-sided view of the continent, East Africa, my region. And as we know, as many of you guys in this room are journalists cover bad news, more or less. We cover the bus that falls off the cliff, not the one that goes down the road, or the politician that steals, millions of dollars, not the one that's just doing his job. That's what news is. It's the extreme, it's the dramatic, it's the scandalous. But I tried to get away from that, and as I spent more and more time, I began to shift a bit more into environmental issues. I felt very strongly about wildlife in Africa. Africa is home to some of the most, spectacular, rare, precious wildlife on Earth. And while I was there, this horrible slaughter began of elephants and rhinos and other animals because there was this demand for ivory in China, and the Chinese were willing to pay whatever it took to get their hands on these tusks. And hundreds of thousands of elephants have been killed in a very short period, pushing elephants closer to extinction than they've ever been in the history of mankind. And I also began to cover more issues about demographics and growth and land use that were a little drier than some of the wars and conflicts I've been covering, but very important. One of the last pieces I did in Kenya was about land and how, if you look at the population projections of Africa, it's like a very steep curve. India is similar in that sense, where China has taken, very drastic measures to control its population. India hasn't, Africa hasn't. And if you look at the projections of where these populations are going to go in the next 20 or 50 years, it's astounding. And Africa, many people depend on land, on agriculture. There's very little industry. India, this is true to some degree, but it's changing rapidly. Africa hasn't really hit that point yet. And so I did this big piece about how there's going to be this crisis where the population is growing, the availability of land is shrinking, the land is actually getting worse because of the use of pesticides, over-farming, environmental damage, issues that are coming up here. And then you're going to have more people that need that land. And already these plots are getting cut up into little pieces. And if a family has 5 sons, maybe one of them is going to move to Nairobi, or 2 of them. And you see this urbanization, these huge slums that are sprawling around any big African city. So in this book is very personal. I kind of broke away from the typical journalist memoir, which writes about the stories you've covered and the big events you've witnessed. I do a little of that, but for me this was more a book about growing up and learning how to be a better person and struggling with all the issues struggling with the issues we all struggle with, about how to balance your personal life and your love life and your professional life and your ambition with your urges to help people. And I didn't always get it right. And one liberating thing in writing this book was just owning my past, owning my mistakes, owning my own history, which was a very edifying experience to just face it and think about why I made the decisions I made, how I learned from them, and what I'd want to transmit to others. And it was only at the very end stages of this book that I kind of realized that if I should be writing a book like this, I should be writing it for my kids. Well, we have two boys who are 6 and 8 years old, and that was kind of the right tone, the right frame of mind, which is, what would I want to tell them about how their parents met, why they were born in Africa, how we began life together in this beautiful place in Kenya, which is unusual for 2 little American kids. And that helped me sort of realize how I wanted to tell this story. And it's not perfect for those of you who bought the book or who have read the book or who might read the book. If I could do it over again, I would do it differently. But it's kind of like life itself. You reach towards the end of your life and you think, okay, there are certain things I definitely would have done differently, but I still feel good about what I've accomplished, what I've said, who I've become friends with. And that's how I feel about this book. I feel like I expressed what I wanted to say. I learned a lot about writing it. Maybe the next book will be Love India.
Does your experience in Africa give it a different kind of perspective when you go and write about India?
I think India is a lot harder to cover in many ways. I think war is such a dramatic subject and journalists gravitate towards the dramatic. So in a way, it's easier to work in a region where these big conflicts are happening, everywhere you look, because there's people whose lives are on the line. They're going through incredibly traumatic experiences. For somebody like me, I like to write about people. I like to do things that are kind of more in the human interest vein. I don't. There's some reporters that love politics. I'm not one of them. I like being in the field. I like talking to people. I like meeting people from a totally different walk of life and trying to share their experience with others, in the U.S. and around the world, reading the New York Times, that will probably never, walk in the camps where the Rohingya are, or the deserts of Somalia, or the jungles of Congo. I like that. I like bringing this other world alive and sharing that. So India, in a way, is perfect for that, because it's very different, it's very rich, it's very sensual, but it doesn't have the conflict. And I wanted a break from that, because it gets very depressing. And I wrote about this when I wrote about the Rohingya camps. I did a piece about a woman who was raped. Her family was massacred. Her village was destroyed. She was, lost everything. And I felt really helpless and frustrated and depressed working on that story. Because here, for those of us who are journalists, you interview these people and there's nothing you can do for them and there's nothing you should do for them. Our role is different. Our role is to bear witness and I write about that in the book, resisting that. But that's our role. We're not there to pass out supplies or to provide counseling or to help somebody rebuild their lives. That's not our role. We go into these areas, we take material, we try to write it in a way that's compelling so people care, and then we leave. And I just remember watching this woman who was about 20 years old walking back into this huge, sprawling, squalid, crowded, noisy camp. And she was this frail figure just sort of disappearing into this crowd. And I just kind of extracted from her the worst things that a person can survive. And then I just see her disappear. And then I wrote a second piece about my feelings of helplessness as a journalist. So, unfortunately, I've gotten good at writing these very sad stories. It's one thing, that's why I won the Pulitzer Prize, because I was in Somalia at a time of famine and witnessed, children dying and people suffering on a huge scale that very few places in the world, however poor, do not suffer on that scale. India may have its poverty problems, but you don't have hundreds of thousands or millions of people dying of hunger. And that happens still today in South Sudan, in Somalia, especially a couple other countries, Nigeria. So I was looking for something different. I felt like it was kind of wearing me out and hurting me inside. And there's also a practical aspect of risk. To get these stories, you have to be willing to risk your life time and time again, to go down a road that you don't know if it's safe, to walk into an interview with some warlords or rebels or guys committing atrocities, and you don't know if they're going to kidnap you or hurt you or, get angry at a question you ask and freak out. And so we, as a father now, I just felt like I needed to recalibrate my priorities. There's a chasing of glory in journalism. It's true. It exists. I mean, we do it because we care and we want to help people, but there's also this ambition and this sense that we're a hero and we're going to break open this big story that nobody's telling and everybody's going to react to that. And I just felt like that's dangerous, and the worst thing I could do for my kids would be get myself killed. So when the India option came up, it appealed to me on many levels. But like I say, I think it's harder. So if anybody has suggestions about stories, things to do here, I'm an open book.
But during your time, you say, when you're working in East Africa, did you find it difficult because there are some despots? I mean, you were in Sudan actually, you see, and Omar Bashir was there, you see. Now in Kenya, it is Uhuru Kenyatta is also there, and both of them they say that we will not adhere to the International Court of Justice, you see, in The Hague actually, you see, and in spite of the fact that many atrocities were committed by them. So did you find it when you're working there, some kind of a gag on the foreign press, or maybe you as a New York Times correspondent there, while you were reporting in Africa actually?
No, it's a good question, and when you talk about these African leaders who have refused to give up power and stay in their position far beyond what anybody expected, I use that with my bosses, because when I hit the 5-year mark, they're like, hey, do you want to move on from Africa? And it's like, no. And then when I hit 7 years and 9 years, 10 years, I said, I'm just being like an African leader. I'm extending my term limits. There's a lot of different ways to answer this question. One point I'd like to make, and we have a diplomat here from Zambia. Zambia is a vast exception to most of sub-Saharan Africa It's a peaceful country that has almost no history of ethnic conflict and has had several peaceful transfers of power. That's sadly unique in sub-Saharan Africa. There's only a handful of countries that have done that. And yeah, I just want to remark on that because that's what makes Zambia a special place. Most of Africa is not like that. And the biggest problem in Africa, and maybe you would agree, the people who've been there, is leadership. It's not necessarily poverty. It's not necessarily education. It's definitely not natural resources. These African countries have more natural resources than the entire world. Congo, there was something like $20 trillion of minerals, of gold, diamonds, copper, cobalt, tin, timber, hydropower, the biggest rivers in the world that could light up the entire continent in Europe. It's not about education. Kenyans are I'll speak mostly from Kenya because that's where we lived. They're very well educated. Every Kenyan speaks 3 languages, just about. Just about any urban or even semi-urban Kenyan speaks English, Swahili, and their mother tongue. So if they're from the Luo tribe, their parents spoke Luo to them, they studied English in school, they speak Swahili on the streets. I mean, India's similar. You guys could probably could make the same case, but that's, for a dumb American who only speaks English and I study Swahili.
They speak American, not English.
No, you guys speak Indian.
We do. Americans speak American. That's what your TV commentator, one of the anchors was saying,
But the education is not the problem, and it's not even poverty. I mean, yes, it's hard to be poor, but it's the leadership. It's this lack of public interest. Leadership is nothing. It's not abstract. It's a lack of public interest. It's not caring about the people in your country who you have been elected or you've taken power to serve their interests. They just don't care. It's about enriching yourself and your family and your tribe, and those are all connected. You see your group, your ethnic group is your people, and it's all about helping them. And you see this in South Sudan, you see this in Kenya, you see this in Uganda, you see this everywhere. And so these despots play off that. Now, just to answer your question more directly, were there problems for me? Most places not. I was given, the term for white man in Africa is Mzungu, which literally means the man who walks in circles in Swahili. Because, and there's a debate about the derivation of that term, but the thought is the first white men that any Africans saw in East Africa were explorers, and they walked in a circle. Started in one place, came all the way around. But there's also a term for dizziness, which is kizunguzungu. And there was a thought maybe the first white people were getting dizzy from malaria and dropping dead, and they just called them Mzungus. So there's a Mzungu card that I carry. They're not going to mess with me most of the time because there will be consequences. My embassy will get involved. Their government will get involved. It can make them look bad. They want to promote trade. They want to promote business. Most African countries do care about their external image, and I'm kind of a vessel for that. So if they harass me and I start writing things about how horrible this country is, it hurts the image of that country, which even if they don't have a national interest, maybe their business deals will go sour. But there were times, my wife and I mean, this woman sitting in the front row was in an Ethiopian prison with me for a week. Yeah, the Ethiopians didn't care about that Mzungu card, and because we were working on a story in a part of the country that they had sealed off, and the military was abusing people, and they were massacring them and raping women, and nobody was doing the story, and we found a way to get in legally, and we're in the process of telling that story, and we got snatched by the Ethiopian army that took all of our materials, all of our notebooks, cameras, film, and we managed to get some of it out, sneak it through, thanks to her. I won't give it away. But they didn't give us any cut us any slack. It's getting harder though. It's getting harder. Getting visas for some of these African countries like Burundi, Congo, Sudan is getting harder. They're wising up, and they're keeping foreign journalists out. And African journalists don't have the independence. It's nothing. This is another point. if I had a Tanzanian newspaper in my office. Kenya has a couple decent newspapers. South Africa, of course, has some good newspapers. Besides that, there's not that many strong newspapers. India, I get 8 good newspapers every day, and that's just the English language ones. So the free press is not an institution the way it is in Africa. And so often these African journalists, they would get thrown in jail, they would get harassed, they'd get killed if they tried to write the stories I wrote. And so that was dangerous. But I felt strongly. I thought, in a way, what is a better place to practice our profession than a place where you can, when nobody else is doing that work? In India, to be honest, I'm kind of redundant. The Indian journalists are doing a lot of the better stories than I'll ever write, and they're out there and they're doing it. You don't need foreign journalists. In these African countries, I don't want to be disrespectful and say they need us, but they are not allowed to do the work that we can do or have the resources to do. My company can send me into Congo and spend $10,000 for a 2-week trip up the Congo River to write about wildlife. That's very expensive. I got to buy the fuel. I got to rent the canoe. I got to fly from here to there. I got to employ translators. That stuff is expensive, and no African news organization can do that.
The question is what your opinion is about what's happening today in India. Democracy in danger, I believe, is the tagline for what's happened. So,
no, those are both both interesting questions. I chose to be a journalist because I wanted to go to Africa. I was a college kid that was totally lost and confused. One benefit of the American system of education is you study like 10 different things at once. In England and in other places, you specialize early, and that's what you do. You study literature, you study medicine, you study science, you study history. That's basically what you do as an undergrad. The US system is totally different. You take, literally like 5 different subjects each semester, and I was like that. I didn't know what I wanted to do. Eventually, I settled on this idea that journalism would be the best way to work in Africa. And I like to write. I mean, it was like 90-80% about Africa. I also enjoyed writing and traveling. So it was just a good fit for me. But as you said in the introduction, it was hard. Like, journalism is a hard profession to make it in. It's not like you get good grades, you go to a good school, you come out, you got a good job. Like, not at all. I had to start at the bottom at a very local newspaper, making not a lot of money. My wife had no interest in living in this little redneck town that I was based in Florida. She said she felt scared every time she came and visited. And so it was a scramble. You got to really love it, and I saw many good journalists along the way that dropped off the path. People that were very talented, very smart, and just couldn't be bothered to stick it out because of the hardship in a way. You're not making a lot of money. You don't have choice of where you're going to work. You have to go from market to market to market to work your way up. So it was hard. As far as democracy in India, I'm like way underqualified to take any big swipe at that question. I have seen a retreat of democracy in Africa. I watched that happen. When I got there in 2006, there was a lot of pressure by the U.S. government and Western governments to make sure these African governments were having clean elections, were having transfers of power, and so much of that has disappeared because of a focus on terrorism and security. And there's even a term, democracy fatigue. There's this idea that some of the more successful African countries are the least democratic ones. And this idea of a China model, that maybe the Chinese have a better way of developing a country than the Western model, and that you have a very tightly controlled central government. You don't put much emphasis, on human rights or democracy, and you just try to build roads, build infrastructure, create jobs. And that's how the Chinese are doing it, and they've done, an amazing job in creating industries. Rwanda is like that. Ethiopia is like that. Some of the freer countries are not as impressive when it comes to growth rates. So I've seen this retreat, and you see it in Russia, you see it in the United States. Like, we're living in a world where the strong man is rising up, and maybe the best word for it is intolerance. Like democracy and tolerance are connected at the hip. And there's more intolerance in the world today. Everywhere you look, basically. Religious intolerance, ethnic intolerance, sectarian intolerance, cultural intolerance. You know, we've seen those forces in the US, and people say those forces are here in India. But I just don't want to like stick my neck out too far because I've just been here a few months.
The thing, and what I want to ask is that I'm intrigued by the title. Okay, the little English that I did, I taught English in high school. So if I put love and remove the comma, love Africa, right? It means totally a different thing. And if I have love, comma, Africa. So basically, why did you come up with such a title?
That may be the hardest question I'm going to have to answer. You're totally right, and I really appreciate you coming. And I don't mean to speak for Africa. Was a guest and visitor in Africa. I have a deep affection for my experiences in Africa, but I don't pretend that I'm African or to represent Africa. And sometimes people, they're like, hey, you're just, another white guy passing through Africa. Who are you to write a book about Africa? And my answer is, this was my experience. It meant a lot to me. That's as far as it goes. As the title, it's really hard coming up with a title for a book. You're trying to encapsulate all these different threads. In this book especially, I'm writing about my profession, I'm writing about African politics, I'm writing about my personal life, I'm writing about this changing world that started in 1990. This book starts in 1990 and it ends in like 2013, 14 when I finished writing it. I liked the title Love Africa, which Courtney's father came up with. It was his suggestion. And because it can mean a few different things. It can be almost like a letter from Africa, like Love Africa. It can mean love and Africa, which is what the book is about. It's about my struggles to honor the things I loved and this place, Africa. It can almost be like a command, like Love Africa. So I just was playing with that a little bit. And I wanted something, I wanted something that shared how I felt. Not just a drier title that might have been catchy but didn't show any emotion. And it worked out. I think they did a great job with the cover. I mean, all this stuff is like the result of tons of emails and arguments and discussions. And I think it all connected really well. I think the way this book looks and the title speaks to how I feel. And if anything, I feel like, and one thing we've left out tonight is, I write a lot about conflict. Africa's associated with conflict and poverty and war, and as you were saying, institutions are weak in a lot of these countries and they just ride over them, and it's all about personal power, right? It's not about the institution of the presidency or the Constitution. It's about who has the strength. But Africa, for those of you who've been in, how many people have been to the continent of, or sub-Saharan Africa? So for those of you who've spent some time there, it's the warmth, it's the spirit, it's this openness that's what infected me. That there was just this care towards others, and expressing that, which you don't see in a lot of the world. And you couple that with these very difficult circumstances where people don't have a lot of money and they don't leave their towns and they're dealing with diseases and hardships, but still this warmth. And so that's what I wanted to capture in the book too, to say there's so much more to Africa than what I myself have written, in the New York Times. I mean, most of the front page stories, I would get it from my editors. Oh, can we get a good news story every once in a while? And sometimes I would write them. I'd write an uplifting story about a blind boxer in Uganda, a man who was blind, who was still trying to stay fit and to compete in his own way. Or I'd write about a business that was showing great signs of growth, and they'd bury that story inside the paper. And then I'd write a story about a massacre, front page, above the fold, all over the place. So that's the image I was reinforcing. And so that was a big reason why I wanted to do this book.
We believe there is also the conspiracy theory very much floating in the region that the white men have done the destruction in Africa. How much really of the cruel oil explorations and those big giant company have done of the conflict upon the tribes, that they support one tribe against the other, and then they landed up in the civil war, and we blame it on the people of the country while we know that it has been done by somebody from outside. This is one of the questions which has been hunting us for a long time. The second part of my talk is actually because now we feel that there are shifts from the Middle East into Africa with the Salafist, with the Wahhabism, with the, this have been changed the demographic of the moderate, as we see the moderate Muslim in Africa become more of a fanatic, more of an extremism. These are two of the issues. I'd like you to elaborate a little more since you lived for long. What's your personal assessment? I know sometime when we write for newspaper, you may be handicapped in putting these on perspective. If you can highlight it for us, I'll be more appreciated. Thank you.
No, it's an excellent point. It's a big question of how much of sub-Saharan Africa's problems are due to outside influence. I do think the way Africa was colonized and treated in the Cold War, and I write about this in the book, Africa had the misfortune of getting its independence in the height of the Cold War. If you look at when sub-Saharan African countries got independence, it's from like 1960 to 1975. I mean, some of these Portuguese colonies went independent very late in 1975. They got sucked into the Cold War immediately, one side or the other. And so the United States, this beacon of democracy, found itself supporting very horrible dictators, one after the other, just because we were scared of communism. And so a lot of, like Congo, for instance, I've written a lot about the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's the biggest country in sub-Saharan Africa geographically. It has something like 80 million people. It's got a ton of resources. It also has a ton of misery and civil war. A lot of that has to do with the Cold War. We kept this guy Mobutu in power for 30 years, and he destroyed that place. And then before that, it was brutally colonized by the Belgians and King Leopold. For those who are familiar or not with Congo, it's got the most brutal colonial history of almost any colonized country. The Belgians put villages into chains. They cut off people's hands to make people get more ivory and rubber. Because the tire had been invented and automobiles were invented right when Congo was being colonized. So there's a scramble for rubber, and then there was a scramble for ivory. So a lot of the problems in Africa can be traced all the way back. As far as oil, I don't think that is a big a factor. I don't see, I don't know. I don't see that. The way the oil industry works in Africa, like Nigeria, you have big American companies that have been working there for years through different governments. They're not really getting involved in civil conflict. South Sudan, you had the Chinese there. They weren't really getting involved. A lot of these things can continue even if there's civil conflict. So it's like these business interests don't really care if there's a civil war raging as long as they can keep working. Then your question about Wahhabism and extremism. It's very interesting. I saw it happen in Somalia. Somalia was a pretty moderate place, and then it took this Wahhabi turn. Part of that is connected to the first part of your question. The U.S. pulled out of Somalia. There was this incident in 1993, Black Hawk Down, where the United States was trying to intervene in Somalia. This was the first President Bush, then President Clinton. There was a famine. We sent in troops. We tried to feed them. The Somali people started fighting with the Americans. Then they shot down 2 helicopters, killed 18 Americans, and President Clinton's like, we got to get out. We're done. That then led to the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, the failure to intervene, because that happened the next year. These Hutu mobs start massacring people, and Clinton is like, I don't want to get involved and have another incident like we had in Somalia. 1 million people were killed, many of them with machetes. It would have been so easy to have stopped that, and they didn't. But back to Somalia. So after the U.S. left, very abruptly, the Saudis came in and they started funding these Wahhabi mosques and turning people towards Wahhabism. You see that now spreading across the region. To me, it's kind of a small miracle that you haven't seen a connection between these extreme groups in the east and west. So the two biggest terrorist groups in Africa are the Shabab in Somalia and Boko Haram in Nigeria. In between, it's lawless. You have some of the most fragile, troubled countries in the world, the Central African Republics, Sudan, Niger. They could easily link up in the Sahara and take over that space. Gaddafi was holding a lot of that in check. It was very interesting. When Gaddafi was playing these African countries off each other, playing leaders off each other, he had a ton of money. Libya has a population of like 6 million people, and it produces a ton of oil and natural gas. He had money to burn, and he would go to a country like Mali and give them $50 billion, or go to a country like Niger. When Gaddafi was overthrown, there was a lot of instability. There's no accident that Mali then fell, and Niger, and all these countries. I'm surprised it's not worse. But I think that extremism is here to stay. And then if you look at Yemen, like a little closer to here, there's a lot of cross-fertilization between Yemen and Somalia. That space on the Red Sea is like 50 miles, and these guys go back and forth. So if Yemen totally collapses, you're going to see a spillover into Somalia.
Hi, my name is Narayanan. We read a lot about the Chinese influence in Africa. What's your experience?
You know, I always get this question, and I should work it into my introduction. People are really intrigued by what China's doing in Africa. It's a big topic. The short answer is they want minerals. They want natural resources. China has the luxury of looking far into the future. They're not on a 4-year election cycle. The president of China does not have to deliver results in 4 years the way, you know, your system or the US system does. So they can take this long-range strategic view where we want to keep our industries going in China. We need copper. Copper's like one of the best electrical conductors. You need copper for everything that we all use now, right? There's a few places in the world that have a huge copper supply. This man's country is one of them. Congo's another. And they go into these countries in a big way, and they invest in infrastructure. They bribe politicians. They do whatever it takes to lock up the supply of these resources for decades. That's their main goal. They don't get involved in politics. They're not like the Western governments that condition aid. So these African countries love the fact that China is now on the landscape, because they can play China off the West. So it used to be, if you had a big hydropower project or a road you wanted built, the African governments would have to ask for help from the US, from the EU, from the World Bank, and they'd say, we want to do this, we need this help to develop our infrastructure. Can you give us $10 billion? The West would give it, but they'd condition it. And they'd say, okay, but we need you to fight corruption, we need more transparency, and we need this and that. The Chinese will just write the check and say, here you go. So now the African governments can leverage that, and they can say, hey, we need a big plan, and the West is like, well, we'll condition it, and they're like, you know what, we don't want any conditions. And then if it's a country with a strategic piece, like Kenya, where we need their help fighting terrorism, or Ethiopia, you know, we work with their military. And so the Ethiopians are like, you know what, we're not gonna even entertain you telling us what to do, because we'll go somewhere else to get that money. That's mostly the role of China. You now see more Chinese living in Africa. There was this wildlife piece where there was a correlation between where the Chinese road crews were working and where elephants were getting killed. Some groups actually figured this out. They said, you know what, there's been more elephants killed in this corridor, and lo and behold, there's Chinese work crews working in that corridor. And they were, you know, they weren't shooting the elephants themselves, but they were, you know, interacting with locals saying, hey, we want some ivory, we can bring it home, we can make a lot of money, and then that was happening. But I think as China's economy has cooled in the last couple years, there's less investment in Africa. A few years ago, they had enormous leverage.
Is that from the time when you first came to India, to Africa, sorry, and when you left Africa, has the situation gotten any better? Or is it just doom and gloom? And Africa, as far as from what I know, is this miserable, poor, dark place that one reads about I mean, I never hear of any good news coming out of there.
No.
So in those 15 years, has anything really changed or not?
You know, that's a great question, and I try to deal with it towards the end of my book. I think a lot has changed and a lot has gotten better in certain places. Certain countries have gone forward dramatically. Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, South Africa, to some degree, Senegal. There's a handful of countries, Ghana, that are stable, and the business environment and the development and the physical infrastructure is dramatically improved. Internet access, roads, airports, housing, buildings, foreign, business, totally different. Like in Kenya, the stuff we could get in the supermarket when we arrived in 2006 versus what we could get in 2017, totally different. You can get all American products, Western products, quality stuff. There's McDonald's, there's Pizza Hut. Not saying that's a good thing in all ways, but it shows a confidence. That's what it shows. It shows that these big Western companies that are really tight with their money and make very strategic decisions how they invest. And when they invest big. They don't just put in one store, they put in 50, as India has seen with KFC or these other chains, or hundreds. They feel bullish about Africa. So that's changed. But some of these countries have not changed. A place like Congo is as dangerous and brutal as it was when I arrived 10 years ago. Central African Republic is worse. South Sudan was a country that had so much hope. Newest country in Africa, had fought this long rebel war to break off from Sudan at great sacrifice. They did it in 2011. They plunged into war in 2013. They are now massacring and raping and destroying their country as we sit here today. Much worse. Somalia, kind of the same. So my theory is you're going to see some places that are going to keep going up, some places are going to sink. There's less strategic interest in the kind of backwaters, the places that are not deemed, geopolitically important, like Central African Republic or even South Sudan. I'm seeing less interest in those places. There used to be a lot of outcry when there would be massacres or state collapse, and I'm just not. I felt like there was a fatigue.
You said a lot about it. I want you to expand a little on it in your personal experience. That the disaster stories did get reported, but they had, and these were British journalists, American journalists, German journalists, they had to fight like tigers to get anything else through their editor into print. The non-disaster stories, the social stories, the change stories, and so on. Was your experience the same? Did you have to do battle?
Well,
there were people who said the same thing. I mean, I met Joseph Lelyfield, who was in South Africa, who wrote Move Your Shadow. And he said during his period there, he pretty much felt the same.
Well, I really appreciate everything. Your observations are very keen and said with, from somebody who cares a lot about Africa. And just that idea of the laughter and the spirit and the openness. There's an openness. There's openness. You can feel it in physical contact. And I write about this in the book. When you shake hands, when you shake hands in Africa, you do this for about 5 minutes. Yeah, and you're just, people are like, hey, how are you? How's the family? How's the work? And they don't let go. There's this need, this affinity to stay in touch at the most elemental level, and that's a beautiful thing.
There's a saying, sorry, but I have to say this.
Of course.
Indians love this Sanskrit saying of ours, and we trot it out every time we underline it. Absolutely true. Our diversity, Vasudeva Kutumbakam. You'll hear this phrase a lot in India. The whole world is a family. And Africa, just what you said, leading off from that, the saying in Zulu is Ubuntu. I am because you are.
Right.
It's very much Africa.
And that can be turned, that can be twisted. And that's, I think, the root of the really nasty, brutal ethnic violence is that when you see somebody as a threat to your family, to your community, right, you will try to destroy them and everything that they stand for. Here's what I noticed. When I first got the job in 2006, it was much easier getting stories on Africa in the paper. I saw a couple big world events, happen since then. And the advent of ISIS and that kind of, just insidious threat that was spreading across the world and very brutal, that took, that seemed to be, to me, to many more interesting than what was happening in Africa. And it was more threatening, it was scarier. Because all these things that I wrote about really didn't have a Western, they didn't threaten the West. They didn't threaten people outside of Africa. I wrote about the Lord's Resistance Army, one of those, brutal Ugandan rebel group. No hope they're ever going to come to the U.S. and start hacking people up. And the same for these Congo militia groups. It was all confined in these jungles, in these spaces. ISIS wasn't. ISIS was something that scared all of us because they could be anywhere. They could have these lone wolves. They could have somebody that wasn't even connected to the organization do some horrible act of violence in the name of this organization. And then you had the advent of Trump and this like explosion in American politics of everything that we had kind of assumed the way things worked, they didn't. And we were watching the election returns in Nairobi at the American ambassador's house. It was Wednesday morning because of the time difference. It was Wednesday morning, as you guys remember, and we were there with hundreds of people, hundreds of Kenyans, hundreds of Americans. Everybody was shocked, especially living outside of the U.S. We were shocked. We all thought Hillary was going to win. Who's she going to pick for Secretary of State? Who's going to be her chief of staff? We know some of these people. We've seen them come up in the Democratic ranks. And the fact that Donald Trump was president of the United States, So if you look at the New York Times today, half of our front page is taken with Trump stuff. If it's the Russia investigation, if it's the latest thing that he's tweeted or said. Yesterday, I don't know did you see this thing where he called, he referred to African countries and Haiti as shitholes. And it's like, just shows this profound ignorance and selfishness and So that to me is a bigger explanation of the difficulty of getting stories in from Africa. That it's a competitive news hole. For us, it's like the front page is only so big. Our website can only put so many stories. The disaster stories have an urgency to them. Just like the Rohingya thing. I've been in India now for almost 6 months. I've written a couple dozen stories. I got way more reaction to these stories I wrote about the Rohingya than anything else I've written. People will say, oh yeah, I saw that Rohingya story you wrote. They won't mention anything about the pollution story, or I wrote a big economic piece. It's in one ear, out the other. The Rohingya thing, it stuck because it just seems so troubling. And that remains the foundation of a lot of journalism.